So mortality is the whole problem, right? In human life, it's the whole game. You have an expiration date. We're here for a limited time. You don't know when your time is up. It's terrifying. So mortality is like a problem that you cannot solve, but you have to respond to. As a middle-aged man, I feel this pretty keenly, but I am also just someone who is very sensitive to time all the time. All the time. I've come to understand this mostly through my marriage. My wife has illuminated this for me about myself. I think that I am just hardwired to think about time. That when I think about things, life, day-to-day life, it's all in terms of how long are things going to take? We're running out of time. We're going to be late. I hate being late, even though I'm often late, and I just hate it. I take great pleasure in having control over my time when I have sort of autonomy and there are no claims on my time. I'm hardwired to think about time. And I've got a particular time problem right now, which is that I promised myself and you that I would make 10 of these videos, that for 10 weeks, I would sit down and just chat with you. And part of the issue is when I agreed to do that, I had about 5 ideas for videos. So 5 ideas and 10 weeks. It wasn't a great plan. I don't have enough content for 10 weeks. Why did I say 10 weeks? So I've bound myself to this enterprise for the next 2.5 months. And I'm running out of time this week. I gotta get something up this week so that I keep things going. And I didn't know what to talk about. I ran out of time. I didn't have enough time to sort of script it all out, think about what I wanted to say. We're always running out of time. And so I was thinking to myself, well, what could I talk about with no preparation? I thought I could talk about how we're running out of time. And I'm not just being cute here. This is actually something I talk about a lot in my job. I'm a university professor. As you may know, if you're new here, my name is Andrew Moore. I'm an associate professor of great books at St. Thomas University, and I teach a lot of books about mortality. I think about this every year, actually, when I meet first year students. Freshman class comes in, most of them are 18, 19. And one of the things that I always talk about, like right away, is mortality. Sort of a weird thing to do, maybe, but here's why I do it. When you are young, at least this was true for me, I don't think you think much about mortality. The end seems very, very far away, but our mortal nature is our defining feature. This is the thing you have to understand about yourself if you're going to understand your life and what to do with it. Like if you don't reflect on your mortality, everything is possible, right? Everything seems possible when you have infinite time, but as soon as you don't have infinite time, you have to make choices. Who do you want to spend your life with? What do you want to spend your time doing? It's all of a sudden, it's a much more valuable commodity, time, right? Because you have a limited amount of it. And so as soon as you recognize that, every choice you make becomes more meaningful. And my hope is that your choices become more intentional. What are we going to do with our time? Like, how do we respond to our mortality, to this fact of our mortality? So what I'm going to do in the time we have remaining is take you through a number of meditations on death so that we can open up some space to think about the meaning of life. We're going to talk about 4 thinkers. The first one is Shakespeare. We're going to talk about Hamlet. The second one is also Shakespeare. We're going to talk about Shakespeare's sonnets. The third one is Homer. We're going to talk about Achilles. And the fourth one is Hannah Arendt. So let's get started. After all, time's a wasting. Hi. If you're wondering why I'm wearing a different shirt, it's because I had to re-record this Hamlet section because I wasn't happy with it. So already in this video, things are going great. There's this famous scene in Hamlet at the beginning of Act 5. It's late in the play. It's sometimes called the gravedigger scene. And this is where Hamlet encounters this clownish gravedigger who's digging a grave. It turns out to be Ophelia's grave. And he famously comes across the skull of Yorick. Alas, poor Yorick. I knew him, Horatio. A fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy. He hath borne me on his back 1,000 times, and now how abhorred my imagination is. My gorge rises at it. Here hung those lips that I have kissed, I know not how oft. Where be your jibes now, your gambols, your songs, your flashes of merriment that were wont to set the table on a roar? Not one now to mock your own grinning? This is one of many instances where Hamlet meditates on the meaning of death, and here he has encountered the skull of someone who meant something to him. Yorick was the court jester, and he used to play with Hamlet when he was younger, and now he's reduced to bones. Hamlet then asks his friend Horatio this interesting question. Prithee, Horatio, tell me one thing. What's that, my lord? Dost thou think Alexander looked at this fashion in the earth? E'en so. And smelt so? Pah! So Alexander here is Alexander the Great, and here Hamlet and Horatio are discussing the great leveling effect that death has. How even the greatest, the most accomplished of human beings will ultimately be reduced to dust. And this is where the mortality question turns into a meaning question. Because if human life is limited, and in the end, there's no discernible difference between the bones of Yorick and the bones of Alexander, then what really is the point of all this human striving? Does the limited quality of human life make all of our efforts meaningless? Hamlet really struggles with the problem of mortality. This is what's behind his infamous inability to act, because he's worried on some deep level that whatever he does, his actions will accomplish nothing. This is part of what's going on in the to be or not to be speech too, right? To be or not to be, that is the question. So just before we move on, let's look at one short section of that speech and then we'll analyze it. Who would these fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. So Hamlet here says, who would these fardels bear? He means, who would carry these burdens? Who would endure all this? And what he's talking about is life, all the terrible aspects of human life, to grunt and sweat under a weary life. He says the only reason we would endure all this is fear, the undiscovered country. We don't know what's on the other side of life. There is this paralyzing fear throughout Shakespeare's Hamlet that human action will accomplish nothing, and that we only endure human suffering because we are afraid of what's on the other side. We fear the undiscovered country. But this is why I want to turn from here to Shakespeare's sonnets, because I think in Shakespeare's sonnets, we encounter a very different response to the same problem. So Shakespeare's sonnets are a series of love poems, and the first are about 154 of them, if I recall, and the first 126 are addressed to a beautiful young man. So our poet speaks to this beautiful young man, and early in the sonnets, really throughout, but especially early on, the speaker, who is a poet, he is saying, look, you've got to procreate. It's kind of a weird thing. It's like this guy saying to another guy, look, you got to have babies because you are too beautiful. You are so beautiful. The world, you owe it to the world to reproduce, my beautiful friend. And so this is the argument of the sonnets. And the sonnets are maybe even more than Hamlet, a meditation on the nature of time and the limited quality of human life. And so we'll do the same thing again. I'm going to read you a sonnet, and then afterwards we'll talk about it. So this is the most famous sonnet in the whole sequence. I'm sure you've probably heard it before. This is Sonnet 18. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance, or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Holy smokes. I'm drinking cream soda, by the way. I bought my kids, it's summer vacation. We were at Costco, and I bought them one of these, 32 cans of like Crush and root beer. Kids saw that, flipped out. I thought, it's summer vacation. We'll get that. But here's the problem. There's 8 cans of root beer, 8 cans of cream soda, 8 cans of Orange Crush, and then 8 cans of grape. Nobody likes grape. So I've got, the root beer's gone, the orange is gone. Now I got a bunch of cans of grape soda nobody's going to drink. And yes, I could have taken one of the grape sodas and saved like the last cream soda for the kids. Did I do that? No. So Sonnet 18 is this is a beautiful poem, right? And the conceit is he's comparing his beloved young man to a summer's day. And the thing about summer days is that they are too short. And this is actually beautiful, right? It's sort of ironic because summer days are actually long, but even though they are long, they feel too short. They are precious. Time is precious. And then the seasons change, right? Every fair from fair sometimes declines. So everything that's beautiful eventually declines, decays, ages, withers. That's just the natural course of things. And so even though the young man is beautiful, he will someday not be beautiful. Not only will he be old and lose the bloom of youth, he will also eventually be underground. However, the poet responds, "But thy eternal summer shall not fade. This young man will be like a never-ending summer, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade." Right? So even death will never take you. And how is that possible? We'd all like to know. And the answer is because this beloved will live forever in poetry. "Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee." So this poem, this book, preserves the beauty and the life of this young man. Now that is an extraordinary thesis when we think about this, because what Shakespeare is arguing in this poem is that art functions as a kind of remedy to mortality. And one of the ways this makes sense is that, well, art preserves an image of someone who used to exist, right? There's just a kind of literal way that this makes sense. And I think the claim is, it's not just that, it's not purely superficial, right? It's not just that art preserves the image of a person. I think that the proposition is that art, great art, can somehow preserve the essence of another person. Like the subject of the art continues to exist even after death. And not only the subject of the art, but the artist, because the person who's immortalized by the sonnets is Shakespeare. And so in this way too, right, art seems to function for Shakespeare as a kind of response to mortality, the problem of mortality. One of the ways that human beings respond to our mortality is by making art. And this seems to be one of the ways that we try to extend ourselves across time. And arguably, our mortality, this thing that plagues us, this thing that haunts us, that we fear, might be a thing that incentivizes us, that incites the creation of art. Art is one of the responses to our mortality. And this takes me to Homer, because I think this is partly what Homer's Iliad is all about. So Homer's Iliad is roughly 2,700 years old, and it's about the Trojan War. And lots of people die in this battle between the Greeks and the Trojans. But I think one of the striking things about this poem, everybody who's read it remembers this, that when characters die, even almost anonymous characters, unimportant characters, their deaths are often marked by these extraordinary poetic eulogies. So these random characters, some of whom just show up only to die. They appear and then they die immediately. Diomedes or Hector, cuts them down with a sword and then they die. And even if they're nobodies, Homer will often give us these extraordinary similes or these beautiful images to mark the moment of their end. So I'm using the Fagles translation here. This is book 8. So this is a little section about the death of a guy named Gorgythion. "The archer loosed a fresh shaft from the bowstring straight for Hector, his spirit longing to hit him, but he missed and cut Gorgythion down instead, a well-bred son of Priam, a handsome prince, and the arrow pierced his chest. Gorgythion, whom Priam's bride from Aesime bore one day, lovely Castianera, lithe as a deathless goddess. As a garden poppy burst into red bloom bends, drooping its head to one side, weighed down by its full seeds and a sudden spring shower, so Gorgythion's head fell limp over one shoulder, weighed down by his helmet." So this guy is struck by an arrow by accident, in a way, right? This arrow is meant for Hector. Somebody's trying to shoot Hector, and instead they hit Gorgythion. So this soldier falls down and then his head drops to one side, right? Limp. But it's compared to a poppy, right? A flower in full bloom. As the flower blooms, it becomes weighed down and it drops to one side. So it's this image in the moment of this guy's death, we get an image of life and renewal. And again, we see in Homer's Iliad something akin to what we see in Shakespeare's sonnets. There's this proposition that through poetry, these people live on. That poetry is somehow life-sustaining. That through poetry, we somehow overcome mortality. It's it's extraordinary. And so what does this mean for us? I think, so one option is become the subject of a great poet's writing. But I think the other proposition is that the creation of poetry itself, the artist can extend themselves across time through art by making things that last. Human beings can cheat mortality. And that part of the meaning of this sometimes seemingly absurd existence is making things that other human beings will look at. And on the one hand, you want to believe that that's silly. Like, that's kind of romantic or it's sentimental. Oh yes, poetry will somehow resolve the problem of mortality. But on the other hand, 2,700 years, almost 3,000 years, that's a long time. Is it forever? I don't know, probably not, but that's pretty amazing. So there is real, tangible evidence that art allows human beings to transcend time. And we should talk about Achilles in Homer's Iliad. So Achilles, maybe you know about Achilles, he's the greatest Greek warrior. And then he quits the Trojan War because Agamemnon offends him. So he leaves and his pride is offended. And everybody thinks that he's motivated primarily by glory and by honor. But I've always thought that kind of misses the point, because the reason he cares about glory is because, like art, glory is a way of living on after you die. What Achilles is really concerned about, I think, is mortality. I made another video about this. I'll throw a link to that up here on the Iliad and sort of my reading of Achilles. You can check that out up here. This is what I think motivates Achilles. I think it's pretty clear at various points in this poem, he is afraid. He is afraid of the undiscovered country. And it's not until Hector kills his best friend Patroclus that he's pulled back into the battle. And again, it's the death of his friend that moves him, that motivates him. And this is where Homer, I think, points to one of the other major responses to the problem of mortality, and that's love. That's love. So the problem that Hamlet grappled with was about meaninglessness, right? This was his concern, that life sucks and then it ends. And what's the point? And there's this concern in Shakespeare's sonnets that even the most beautiful people, or the people who are most important to us, even they will disappear and they will be forgotten. And this is like a terrible thought. But one of the things that Homer illustrates, I think, in the Iliad is that to question the ultimate meaning of existence, in a way, might be to miss the point, which is that it may be impossible to determine our ultimate objective significance. Like, what is the meaning of my life? That's hard to know. But if we focus incessantly on that question, we miss something much more obvious, which is that we mean a great deal to each other. And this is particularly evident with our loved ones. Being with the people we love is self-evidently good. And even if it's for a limited time, we would still choose that rather than never being with them at all. And this is at the core of the sonnets too, this recognition that love can somehow transcend time too. We continue to love people even after they're gone, so that even after people are no longer on this earth, they continue to mean something to us. And that, I think, is what's demonstrated by the death of Patroclus. His death is meaningless because he meant everything to Achilles. And lastly, I want to talk about Hannah Arendt. This is a bit of a shift, but all of us need to think about what we do with our time. What I do with my time is I spend a lot of it talking about books like these, sometimes on the internet, sometimes in classrooms. And Hannah Arendt, she's a 20th century political thinker who's really writing in the wake of the Second World War and all of the existential crises that followed from that worst event in human history. And I think a lot of her work is about trying to recover some sense of meaning and purpose and stability in human life in the aftermath of so much death and destruction. Her work has really given me a kind of theoretical framework to understand, how I spend my time and what I consider myself to be doing. Arendt has this theory, this idea of the world, which is different from like Earth. It's not like the planet. Her sense of the world is that it's kind of this collaboratively produced public space. So she writes, "This world, however, is not identical with the earth or with nature. As the limited space for the movement of men and the general condition of organic life, it is related rather to the human artifact, the fabrication of human hands, as well as to affairs which go on among those who inhabit the man-made world together. To live together in the world means essentially that a world of things is between those who have it in common, as a table is, located between those who sit around it. The world, like every in-between, relates and separates men at the same time." The world for Arendt, I think, is a source of stability and continuity. It's this thing that we make together where common sense and categories live, right? Shared categories, shared understandings. And it's the thing that allows us to communicate with each other and live together, even though we are very different, even though we are separate, distinct beings. And I think that part of the way we maintain this common world, this thing that allows us to live together and share things with each other is by preserving these works of human hands across time. It's from works of art and philosophy that we get the categories and the language that we need to think together, to live together. And so part of how I understand what I'm doing with my time is that I am helping to preserve these works across time. And I'm doing that by sharing them with my students and sharing them now with you. And it's useful, I think, when you're contemplating your mortality, to think about these works of philosophy and literature that have lasted for hundreds and thousands of years, and to understand that you are not alone, to understand that some of the fears and anxieties that you have, you are not alone. People who lived hundreds and thousands of years ago shared those same fears and those same anxieties. And in the face of those fears, they reached out through writing across centuries, and they reached you. They connected with you. And I don't know, there's something to me that is heartening about that. If I can hear the voice of someone writing hundreds or thousands of years ago, and it is meaningful to me, then their actions had meaning. And if something they wrote and something they said and something they did had meaning, then maybe there's hope for us too. That seems like a good place to end. Hey, I've got this is week 3. I've got at least 7 more weeks to go. If you have ideas for other things I could talk about, let me know in the comments. Because like I said, I've only got so many ideas. To see the other videos in this series, you can go to this little link over here. I'll see you there, and I'll talk to you soon. I'll talk to you next week.